Philosophy of mind was not a separate and self-standing pursuit in the first half of the 20th century. Introductory books included discussion of the mind-body problem in metaphysics, and theories of perception were associated with the problem of skepticism in epistemology. Scientific approaches to psychology had begun to take shape in the second half of the 19th century in Germany, and then it went on to America. Started with Wundt in Germany, and then on in America. And in the first half of the 20th century, inspired by successes in the natural sciences, especially physics, the desire for an empirical observational psychology gave behaviorism a significant edge. As mentioned before, John Watson was the founder of behaviorism in America. Behaviorism accordingly recommended itself also to philosophers wishing either to reduce mental phenomena to behavior or, for most equivalently, to analyze mentalistic terms into behavioral terms. We have also to mention here that psychology is a natural science and started to use the natural sciences, and philosophy also uses the natural sciences in its worldview picture in modern and contemporary philosophy, while philosophy itself still remains a social science. The logical positivists, Quine, Wittgenstein, and Ryle, all in their various ways, appealed to behaviorist strategies for dispensing with talk of the mental. There was no moment in the 2 decades after the Second World War that made philosophers give up any form of behaviorism as a resource for understanding the mind, but the demise of behaviorism in psychology was certainly a factor. The demise of behaviorism in both psychology and philosophy was not, however, the demise of the commitment underlying behaviorism, namely that mental phenomena ultimately are, or are grounded in, natural phenomena, primarily brain function. This redirected efforts in philosophy to thinking about how mental phenomena could be understood or interpreted consistently with rejection of both behaviorism and any form of dualism. Increasing sophistication in neurology, physiology, and biochemistry gave added impetus to that confidence. The natural first port of call was to hypothesize that mental phenomena, in some sense, just are physical occurrences in the brain and central nervous system, the SNS, which is to say that mental events and nervous system events are identical. The first problem was to try to make out how to articulate this idea satisfactorily. Early identity theories of mind, put forward in the 1950s and 1960s, owed themselves to U.T. Place, Herbert Feigl, and J.J.C. Smart. The views of Place and Smart represent something of a halfway house because they thought that intentional phenomena, believing, desiring, are still best understood behavioralistically, whereas phenomenal states, such as pains, hunger pangs, can be associated with physical states of the nervous system. Feigl agreed about phenomenal states, but thought that behaviorism is also insufficient to explain intentional states because an account of them has to include factors that are not exclusive to the person or other organism in question. Other things, other people, or other aspects of the world frequently have to figure in intentional explanations. How would you explain thinking about a tree if no reference to something other than the thought, namely the tree itself, is made, especially if you wish to differentiate between thinking about a tree and thinking about a river? Hence, it would be a category mistake in Ryle's sense to assimilate intentionalistic explanations to behavioral ones. Feigl's point about intentional states is an early hint at what came to be called anti-individualism. As described by one of the chief proponents of this view, Tyler Burge, in his Foundations of Mind, published in 2007, individualism, in this context, is the thesis that an individual's mental states are constitutively independent of any relation to a wider reality, while anti-individualism says that many such states are what they are partly by virtue of relations between the individual in those states and a wider reality. Another name for this kind of view is externalism, and versions of it apply in meaning theory as well as theories of intentionality. The phrases broad content and narrow content are often employed to describe the content of mental states on an anti-individualist or externalist view, and on an individualist or internalist view, respectively. Place argued that the identity in question is not of the x equals x variety, but is compositional identity. A cloud is a collection of water droplets, but a water droplet is not a cloud. In the same way, a mental event is composed out of physical events, and when we know enough about both, we will be able to show how the former reduces to the latter. Fagel and Smart, employing Freya's sense reference distinction, took the view that the identity between types of phenomenal states and physical states is x equals x identity, so expressions describe the respective states and how they differ in sense but refer to the same thing. Two of the chief objections to identity theories are first, that it restricts mental phenomena to brains. What about the possibility that computers or other, not necessarily biological entities, might have mental states? And secondly, that they say nothing about one of the most puzzling features of mental life, namely the existence of qualia, that is, the felt quality of experiences of pain, pleasure, hunger, desire, depression, and the like, the subjective aspect of mental life. This point is central to the vexed debate about consciousness. The first objection says that mental and brain states cannot be identical if mental states could occur in things that are not brains. Identity in the standard sense of x equals x is necessary. But if mental states are multiply realizable, that is, able to be instantiated in different kinds of systems, then the relationship between mental states and brain states is only contingent. A response to this is to weaken the identity claim from type identity to token identity. Instead of saying types of mental states, such as feeling pain, are identical to types of nervous system states, namely the firing of C fibers, these being the non-myelinated nociceptor fibers in animal bodies that deliver the first sharp sensation of pain. We only claim that token mental states are identical to token central nervous system states. The distinction between type and token is most easily explained thus. Each individual human being is a token. An example and instance of the animal type, kind, and species. Homo sapiens sapiens. Or in the seashells on the seashore, there are 8 tokens of the letter S. Token identity allow multiple realizability of mental states while retaining the fundamental commitment of any identity theory to this token mental state is x equals x identical with this token other state, whatever that state is, though in humans it is a state of the body. Another approach is functionalism, which says that mental states are to be identified by the causal roles they play, independently of what brains, the wetware or the dryware computers say, carries out the causal operations themselves. So to say what a pain is, or a memory, or a desire, is to say what causal roles are played respectively by pains, memories, and desires, independently of what system is doing the work. It is a black box theory out of the consideration for the multiple realizability constraint, and therefore hospitable to widely varying interpretations, including ones that are at direct odds with each other. The basic idea is that mental states are functional states, where these latter are inputs and outputs together with relations between inputs and outputs. The aim is to avoid restricting mental states only to biological brains, and at the same time to avoid being so permissive as to attribute mental states to almost any functional device, the central heating control monitor in your house, for example. An immediate objection to functionalism is that it does not seem to provide a way of locating a place between the two permissive and two restrictive views to satisfy intuitions about mental life. It does not at all address the question of the subjective nature of mental states, which in some cases makes no causal difference at all, as one sees from inverted spectrum examples. Whenever you see green, I see blue, but this difference makes no difference to how we behave in regard to things that seem green to you and blue to me. Moreover, I might regret something, but not do anything about the fact that I regret it. What is the causal role in terms of which regretting, as an intentional state, is to be characterized? A famous example offered by John Searle suggests that functionalism cannot adequately account for such intentional states as understanding. Imagine a person possessed of an exhaustive rulebook for correlating strings of Chinese characters to each other. He's given a string of characters, looks it up in the rulebook to find the string of characters it is there matched with, and hands back this second string. To someone who understands Chinese, he is providing intelligent responses to questions or remarks, but he himself has no idea what any of the strings of characters mean. We can suppose that he does not even know they are Chinese characters. To him, Japanese and Korean script might be indistinguishable from Chinese script. On a functionalist account, a mind is just like this person. It carries out a task, but by hypothesis without knowing what it is doing. Searle aimed this example at the claim that the software-hardware relationship in a computer models the mind-brain relationship in animals, minds thus being the software of the brain. But it hits both targets, functionalism and the computer analogy. For Searle, the moral is that there cannot be intentionality without consciousness. Searle's Chinese room argument prompted a vigorous controversy. One response to it was to say that even though the man in the room does not understand Chinese, the entire system of which he is just a part does not understand Chinese. Searle replied that if the man made himself the entire system by learning the rule book by heart, generating strings of characters, matching them to other strings, and issuing the latter, he would still not understand Chinese. Donald Davidson's anomalous monism constitutes another argument against type physicalist identity theories. His view described earlier is that although mental events cause physical events, and although all causal relations are governed by natural laws, there are nevertheless no natural laws governing the causal connections between mental and physical events. As we have seen, the inconsistency among these commitments explains the term anomalous. Davidson's invocation of the idea of supervenience to describe how mental states might, in some sense, be dependent on physical states, despite the absence of psychophysical laws, constitutes a form of non-reductive physicalism. Some commentators describe Davidson's view as a token identity theory, although doing so does not sit comfortably either with the notion of supervenience or with its associated rejection of reductionism. The difficulty of locating this view on the spectrum of physicalist theories is a product of the fact, which he emphasizes, that talk of rationality enters essentially into many mental descriptions, but has also no role in physical descriptions. Every effort to account for the former exclusively in terms of the latter must, therefore, fail to do so adequately. And yet, there can be no question of reintroducing any form of substance dualism under the disguise of an aspect dualism or property dualism of the kind that might most naturally characterize anomalous monism. A significant aspect of Davidson's contribution is his refocusing of the debate away from discussion mainly of sensation and back towards intentionality as the mark of the mental, citing the 19th century philosopher-psychologist Franz Brentano's view to this effect. Every mental phenomenon, Brentano wrote, is characterized by what the scholastics of the Middle Ages called the intentional or mental inexistence of an object, and what we might call, though not wholly unambiguously, reference to a content, direction toward an object, which is not to be understood here as a meaning a thing, or immanent objectivity. Every mental phenomenon includes something as object within itself. This permits identification of mental states by their content. Thus, believing and desiring are attitudes understood in terms of what is believed and what is desired, respectively. The attraction of this view for Davidson becomes clear when one recalls the theory of interpretation. Ascribing propositional attitudes is affected by interpreting linguistic behavior in a context. We impose conditions of coherence, rationality, and consistency on the agent's behavior and its causes, which in effect means that ascertaining the meaning of what an agent says is achieved by applying a theory of mind to what she or he does. Everything that we wish to know about mind is accordingly revealed by what work mental concepts do in enabling radical interpretation. Whereas Davidson's version of non-reductive physicalism was attractive to some, its connection with his theory of interpretation proved less so, principally because his claim that it reveals everything that can be said about mind entails that a scientific psychology is not possible. For some, this raised the suspicion that anomalous monism might, after all, just be a version of epiphenomenalism, the view that mental phenomena are merely byproducts or incidental effects of the far more significant physical events in the brain that cause them. This cannot be a criticism of Davidson, though, because epiphenomenalism explicitly denies that mental phenomena exert any causal influence on physical phenomena, whereas it is precisely the anomaly in Davidson's view that mental states indeed cause physical behavior, but not under the government of any law that contains mental descriptions. Suspicions of epiphenomenalism, raised by unclarities in non-reductive forms of physicalism, remind one of the questions it prompts. What is the point of mental phenomena if they are epiphenomenal? They might just be a wasteful accident of evolution. If they have no role to play in causing behavior, they are of no use in interpreting behavior, linguistic and otherwise. The world might as well be populated by zombies with no minds at all as by creatures whose mental lives are inefficacious byproducts of what is really doing the work. Indeed, the criticism that non-reductive physicalism could lead too readily into a collapse that goes into epiphenomenalism makes it look questionable. At the very least, it makes the theory seem as if it has a latter-day version of the problem Descartes once faced. He, one recalls, was unable to explain how a causal connection can obtain between mental and physical phenomena if they are wholly different substances. Any view that says mental phenomena cannot be reduced to physical phenomena, and which is not epiphenomenalist, has to find some account of how they connect. Such an account is obviously impossible on the premise that no connecting laws exist. Old problems are not always solved by being dressed in new clothes. The idea that mental states cause behavior, and that we explain and predict behavior by ascribing it to mental states as its inner origin, is such a natural one that it constitutes the ordinary assumed view of most people. We are, on the whole, rather good at interpreting and predicting others' behavior, and the ready use of concepts of desire, belief, intention, hunger, lust, hope, misery, joy, and other inner states of mind is said to constitute a folk psychology that we pick up as we develop from infancy onwards. It constitutes tacit knowledge, implicit knowledge that we might not even be fully aware that we have, rather like our knowledge of grammar. Its success might be taken as an indication that whatever the mentalistic terms refer to, whether neural processes in the brain or something else, folk theory itself has a lot right about the mind. This view is robustly rejected by eliminative materialism, the theory that folk psychology is radically wrong and that the states and processes its terms purport to refer to do not exist. Any theory that denies the existence of any class of entities is eliminativist with regard to that class. Ad materialism and eliminative materialism announces itself as a theory, saying that the only things that exist are material and physical states and processes. Indeed, any theory about the mind which is materialist is, just in virtue of that fact, well on the way to being eliminativist already. Quine asked in Word and Object whether, if mentalistic terms are taken to denote physical events in the brain, this amounted to a theory of the mental, saying that mental and physical states are identical, or instead a recommendation to abandon reference to mental states altogether. And he then argued that since they come to the same thing, why duplicate what we say? Let us eliminate talk of the mental. Eliminative materialism took center stage with the work of Paul and Patricia Churchland and Stephen Stich. The later's From Folk Psychology to Cognitive Science, published in 1983, and Patricia Churchland's Neurophilosophy in 1986 are important milestones in this development. Patricia Churchland's argument is that once we have a full understanding of the brain, we will fully understand what we now think of as mental states and processes and will not need the folk psychological vocabulary to talk about it. Our situation in regard to mind, Patricia held, is at the same level as Aristotle's understanding of motion. Developments in natural science provided a means to explain how motion can occur without appeal to the agenting activity of anima, and therefore reference to the latter have been eliminated. What distinguishes the eliminative materialism from earlier attempts at physicalist theories of mind and brain is its explicit identification of brain structures as the entities that do the work. Earlier theories had offered no suggestions as to what the brain structures or states, with which mental states are identical to or which they reduce, actually are. They had merely gestured at the whatever it is in the brain that a future science would identify as the right candidate. Developments in neuroscience had now brought philosophy of mind into such intimate connection with itself that it is no longer possible to tell where neuroscience begins and philosophy of mind ends. But eliminative materialism is not merely a strong identity theory, it is eliminative, arguing that there are no such things as beliefs, desires, hopes, and the rest. Consider the difference between saying that lightning is an electrical discharge, where the nature of a familiar phenomenon is explained by a theory with the right resources for doing so, thus replacing, say, lightning is a thunderbolt thrown by Zeus, and saying that demons do not exist. In the latter case, it is not that more adequate resources have come along for explaining demon possession and mental illness. Instead, talk of demons has been eliminated from talk of mental illness altogether. Just this will happen, say the eliminativists, as brain science progresses. The arguments in favor of eliminative materialism are of two kinds: arguments against folk psychology and arguments for the explanatory potential of neuroscience. Some of them are as follows. A theory of mind should imply a program of research which will yield explanations of the phenomena at issue. Folk psychology does not do this. Instead, it ignores whole tracts of mental life, including dreaming, consciousness, learning, memory, mental illness, and those behaviors now known to be the result of brain damage. Moreover, there are parallels with other folk theories about aspects of the world, the weather, physical diseases, animal behavior, which science has displaced. Folk psychology will follow this pattern as knowledge in neuroscience grows. Meanwhile, that knowledge of the brain, neurophysiology, endocrinology, and genetics, which has grown enormously in the course of the 20th century, throws ever more light on mental life, not least as a result of functional MRI scanning, which is fMRI, which makes it possible to observe in real time activation of brain structures in response to various tasks and challenges, greatly enriching knowledge already gained from brain autopsy, correlations with psychological deficits. These are compelling considerations, yet it remains that folk psychological explanation is powerful and predictively successful as an everyday theory of mind, and most importantly, the neurophilosophical approach makes more rather than less mysterious the stubborn facts of introspective experience. We have, or appear to have, direct and privileged access to such mental states as pain, hunger, desire, and the qualitatively rich experience of seeing in color, a remarkable fact, hearing, tasting, and the like. The eliminative materialist response is to say that our interpretations of what is happening within us might be culturally conditioned by the folk psychology we learn as we grow up, just as people in the past claimed to see the demons being cast out in an exorcism. So we might think that we know what some supposedly inner mental state is and turn out to be actually wrong. These last points raise the great question of consciousness, and in particular that aspect of consciousness which consists in being self-aware of having experience in a certain way. Talk of consciousness compromises related notions like being sentient or awake or aware of things other than oneself. But the key problem for any physicalist theory of mind, or indeed any theory of mind, is how to explain the phenomenon that has come to be called the what it is like aspect of consciousness, following Thomas Nagel's famous 1974 paper entitled, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? On observational grounds that we know that bats navigate and find prey by means of echolocation. What we cannot know is what it is like for a bat to see the world through the sound patterns of bounced high-frequency squeaks. There is something it is like for the bat to have such experience, but only the bat can know what it is like. Nagel argued that the chief challenge for physicalism is to account for the subjective character of such experience. He defines possession of conscious mental states as consisting in their subjectively being something it is like to be the possessor of them, and argues that no reductive theory of mental states captures this because such theories are all compatible with the absence of subjectivity, with, in short, zombiehood. Not only do they not capture it, but they seem in principle to be excluded from doing so for two reasons. One is that the nature of such experience can be understood only by occupying the experiencer's viewpoint. The other is that however rich the external empirical data available to an observer, it cannot give him access to that viewpoint. We can know facts about the bat's echolocation capacities, but we cannot occupy the bat's point of view on what it is like to use them. This argument was intended by Nagel not to be a refutation of physicalism, but rather to highlight the special difficulty that physicalist theories have to overcome. Another contributor to the debate, Frank Jackson, did, however, think that these considerations rule out physicalism and devised the Mary's Room thought experiment to show why. A very clever scientist called Mary lives permanently in a room in which the colors are black and white only. She wears only black and white clothes, has a black and white television, and all the books she gets are likewise only ever black and white. She is a vision scientist and knows everything there is to know about color vision, the structure of the eye, the optic nerves, the visual cortex, the part of the electromagnetic spectrum visible to the human eye, and the nature of the visual system's response to electromagnetic radiation at different frequencies. She knows all of this comprehensively, and without herself ever having seen any color other than black and white. One day she leaves her room and sees a red rose. When she does so, says Jackson, she learns something new. She learns what it is like to see red. What she learns is the qualitative character of that kind of experience. This is absent from the comprehensive objective knowledge of color vision. Therefore, says Jackson, physicalist theories are wrong. An argument to similar effect is offered by David Chalmers. He postulates a world inhabited only by zombies, understood as beings who are exact duplicates of human beings in every respect, other than that their experiences have no qualia, no qualitative, subjectively felt character. This is a conceivable world, even though it does not exist, and therefore metaphysically possible, and if it is metaphysically possible, physicalism is false, because it describes human beings exactly as if they were the zombies in that world. Chalmers also distinguishes between the hard problem of consciousness, how to explain qualia, and the easy problems, such as explaining the brain's performance of various cognitive functions, such as processing sensory inputs, integrating information, and the like. The hard problem is to explain why the performance of these functions is accompanied by the phenomenon of what it feels like to perform them. The inability of physicalist theories to explain qualia is known as the explanatory gap, and some, Chalmers himself, Jackson, and Kripke among them, infer an ontological gap from it, namely that consciousness is not physical. Of course, physicalists respond either by denying that there is an explanatory gap, which by itself closes the ontological gap, or by accepting the explanatory gap but denying that it entails an ontological gap. Daniel Dennett, for a chief example, argues that there is no explanatory gap because he says there are no such things as qualia. They are a philosophical fiction. He justifies this by arguing that the brain in fact latches on to just a few significant details at any given moment, only thus being able to function because it would become inefficiently overloaded if it sought to handle too many items of information simultaneously. Experiments show that we leave out a lot of information even about a present perceptual environment. For example, the famous gorilla and ball players experiment, which you might know, in which most people who watch a video of people passing a ball among themselves and who are asked to count how many times they do it, completely fail to see a full-sized gorilla figure walk in among the players, beat its chest, and walk off screen. Indeed, similar such experiments show that the world as we perceive it, it is a virtual reality construction. But critics of Dennett's position argue that this does not show that there is no such thing as consciousness. It is impossible to persuade anyone that the feeling of warmth in her hands as she holds them near a fire and the feeling of intense pain that he feels when he puts them in the fire are illusions. Just because we cannot explain consciousness on the basis of present knowledge should not be a motivation for denying its existence, nor should the fact that it is irreducibly subjective and accessible only to one privileged observer entail that it does not have a physical basis. This view says that the explanatory gap is real, but does not have to entail an ontological gap. It might just be a function of the present inadequate state of neuroscientific knowledge. At the other end of the debate, there are those who think that the hard problem is simply too hard ever to be solved. On this view, consciousness cannot understand itself any more than an eyeball can see itself. Not many accept this counsel of despair. One respectable position is that whatever future neuroscience might reveal, the predictive and explanatory utility of folk psychological concepts still remains, and rather impressively so.